Hi, this is Doug Goldstein from the Goldstein on Gelt Show. You're going to love this interview that I did with Harvard professor Mihir Desai. It turns out that he and I don't seem to agree on everything, not the least of which is whether it's a good idea to go into debt. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people love taking on debt. They borrow money and they buy stuff. To me, it seems like a real problem because eventually you have to pay that money back. But the professor has a different opinion on it, and quite frankly, even though I don't think we see eye to eye, I fully understand his opinion. If you are dealing with debt, whether you're thinking of taking some on or just very self-righteous thinking that you don't have any, you'll definitely enjoy this interview. One of the big problems that a lot of people have that the professor is going to point out in our discussion today is that people don't learn from the mistakes of the past. Ideally, you'll learn from other people's mistakes, but even people aren't learning from their own mistakes. People who got crushed in 2008, they borrowed too much money, they bought too much house. But there is a way, according to the professor, to use debt to really, really improve your life. So check it out and let me know what you think at goldsteinongelt.com. Okay, I'm very excited to be talking today with Mihir Desai, who is a professor of finance at Harvard Business School and a professor of law at Harvard Law School. He's got a new book out called The Wisdom of Finance, Discovering Humanity in the World of Risk and Return. Mihir, I have to tell you, this is not really an overlap that a lot of people talk about, humanity and Wall Street. Tell me what you're thinking there.
Well, exactly right. I think most people think the title is a little bit of an oxymoron, like a contradiction in terms. But that's in fact the whole point, which is there's a lot more tying together wisdom and finance than you would think about. The goal of the book is to demystify finance and to hopefully rehabilitate it. So demystify it is in the sense that many people find finance intimidating and they kind of find the ideas a little hard to access. So the idea in the book is you get all the big ideas of finance, but only through stories. So no equations and graphs, nothing intimidating as a way into the ideas. And then second, I think chunks of finance are broken. And so the way to hopefully fix it is to make the people who participate in it look at their work through a moral lens. And that's what humanities do. That's what they're good at. They're good at making us understand issues through a moral lens. So
Can you explain what that means when you said chunks of finance are broken? What are we talking about there?
Yeah, so I think the finance industry, 10 years after the financial crisis, remains problematic. There's a lot of value extraction going on as opposed to value creation. I think that's a problem. And so we haven't really fully come to terms with that. And I think, regulation has helped a little bit. Outrage has maybe helped people feel a little bit better. But the reality is the industry still has a long way to go. And I think instead of looking at spreadsheets and screens, I want people in finance to really think hard about what they're doing and the human dimension of it. And that's what the humanities do.
Finance is a very big world. From my standpoint, I just want to tell you about my day job. In real life, I am a personal financial advisor. I only get to do the radio gig once or twice a week. A lot of what I do personally is I work with people, and I like your model of telling stories, and I try to listen to what their story is and help them to figure out how can they come to a fine conclusion of their story eventually and build a portfolio that makes sense. When you're talking about finance, are you not talking about this kind of world, but you're talking about kind of like the too big to fail banks?
So I'm talking about both worlds, right? So they intersect. So there are there's a big bad world of finance, which is large financial institutions. And then there's the microfinance, right? Which is in our lives and our retirement savings and all the things you help, your clients with. But they're linked because people use those big financial institutions in all kinds of ways. And those are actually kind of very tightly linked. So, my goal is to make the big financial institutions and the big players in finance behave better, but also restore the credibility for people like your clients. So they don't view finance, with quite the skepticism that they might now. I'm not sure if you find that, but a lot of people here in the US at least kind of view a lot of people in finance and a lot of financial institutions with a great deal of skepticism.
Yeah, I hear that, but I wonder if the guy on the street really feels that he's getting bad service, for example, at the counter of the bank, and so that's how he feels. Or they're computerizing everything, so he can't even get a meeting with a branch manager if he needs a loan or something like that. As opposed to saying something like, well, we know that the big banks, try to push through regulations which would allow them to continue doing all sorts of complex trading strategies, knowing that at the end of the day, if they didn't work out and they needed a bailout, then the FDIC would come along and, or the government on its own would come along and make everything better. What part of the world of finance are normal people really worried about?
Well, I think it depends on, what people's exposure to the financial crisis was. But I mean, in short, I think 10 years later, people are still licking their wounds about what happened. Certainly in the US, there's a sense that, did we learn anything really from that really dramatic episode? And, we're still living with the consequences of that dramatic episode. So I take your point, which is, obviously most people are concerned with their day-to-day lives. That's really what they experience in terms of finance. But first, I think there are these macro issues which are still hurting people. And then second, even at the micro level, I think with things like overdraft fees or the inability to kind of maybe get the loans, or the feeling that your loans are kind of very burdensome, certainly in the student loan setting, that gives rise to a lot of skepticism about finance, I think even at the micro level.
We're speaking with Mihir Desai, who is a professor of finance at Harvard Business School. He also teaches at the law school. He recently came out with a book called The Wisdom of Finance. Mihir has been talking to us about the idea of trying to understand the financial world through stories, not a lot of, as you said, equations and graphs. Just tell people what's really going on, and that they should realize that the world of finance is approachable if you understand a little bit more about it. One of the concerns, Mihir, that I've discovered is that it seems that as people are feeling the government is more and more coming in and trying to regulate, the people say, well, I don't have to worry about it. The government will take care of that. And as a result, it seems to me that a lot of individuals maybe didn't learn their lessons from the crash of 10 years ago. And, they're out there taking on more debt. And my guess is that more and more people are going to take on mortgages that they can't afford, or they'll take on adjustable rate mortgages, which as soon as rates go up are going to really devastate them. And they're just not even learning on their own. Is there a way to educate normal people just to be responsible for their own finances?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, right? Which is, and this is, I think, in part, why are people ignorant about it? And part of the story is because we just do such a terrible job with financial literacy at the primary and the K through 12 level. We should be doing much more than we currently do. And then the second reason why is because I think people genuinely do find it intimidating, right? And in part, the reason for that is people in finance like to intimidate you, and they kind of think these ideas are really tough. A good example is debt. People make typically one of two big mistakes. One mistake they often make is debt is bad. All debt is bad. I should never use it, which is a mistake because debt can be wonderful. It can allow you to access opportunities that you wouldn't be able to access otherwise, like education or a home you couldn't otherwise afford. At the same time, if you take on debt, it's a very, very serious commitment. So people are making both those mistakes. Some people are ignoring the possibilities afforded by debt, and then others are actually not taking it seriously enough. So in the book, I use a variety of ways to think about that are more, commonsensical. So for example, in debt, I talk about leverage and why in finance it's comparable to the way you think about commitments in your life, which is commitments in your life actually allow you to experience things you wouldn't be able to experience otherwise, which is the great part of debt. And then secondly, if you break those commitments, you renege to people or to companies or organizations, it has really serious consequences. So kind of by mapping it to commitments as a way to think about what it is in your life, that can be a powerful way for people to understand both why it's great to take on debt and why it's great not to take on too much.
Is this a commitment like marriage? In other words, is that what you're comparing it to?
Yeah, exactly. So, in fact, let's just, in part in the book, I use The Merchant of Venice. Part of what they do in that play is try to suggest that nominally it's about debt, but it's really about commitments. And it's about how people fashion their commitments to each other and how that allows them to do things that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. Marriage, kids, being embedded in a large organization, all those things.
It's sort of interesting because if you take a step back and look at, not to philosophize too much, but where society's coming and how these institutions that maybe we grew up on that seemed a little more holy at a time, like marriage and family, are less and less important. Maybe this is going in parallel with the fact that people simply are not able to see that as a real parallel to something like debt, because as it's actually an interesting comparison you're making, that both of them give you a commitment. Either you're committed to your spouse or you're committed to paying off a loan. But if people already are not so interested in being committed to anyone or anything, then how are they going to be committed to paying back a loan?
That's fair enough. But I think one of the things we realize is that actually commitments are spectacular, right? They access, the best example is kids. It's like the biggest commitment in the world, but you get access to an experience you would never be able to have otherwise. And in a way, the book has all these, parallels laid out. There's a chapter called No Romance Without Finance, which is all about, marriage and the implications of mergers and finance for marriages. There's a chapter on commitments. The corporate governance chapter is about the principal agent problem and uses Mel Brooks and the producers. So it's got like this big mishmash of things from the humanities and culture to explain all these big ideas in finance so that people will kind of think about it in a different way.
All right. Mihir, this is fascinating, actually. I think a lot of people should spend a little time reading this book just to get a different view of finance. I know that the listeners to the show are probably people who are already interested, but teaching yourself and your family and your kids about finance, if it doesn't work one way, you can always try another. So in the last few seconds, just tell us, how can people actually find you, find your work, find your book?
Yeah, so I'm on the web, and my homepage is mihirdesai.org, as well as on Twitter at DesaiMihirA. And of course, the book is available on Amazon and lots of other places.
Okay, we will put links to all of that at the show notes of today's show. Mihir Desai, thanks so much for taking the time.
My pleasure, Doug. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Check out all of Doug's money ideas at goldsteinongelt.com. Doug specializes in helping people who live outside the United States handle their U.S. investment accounts. If you have a question that you would like answered on the air or off, contact Doug at his website or send him an email to doug@profile-financial.com.